We now look at the end of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the war finally to an end. The war was a terribly devastating experience for anyone who was even remotely involved or affected by the war. A heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water, hooded hordes swarming, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. This is from T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Wilfred Owen, who is a famous war poet of England and died in the First World War, in his possession was found, this may be of interest to Indians, a copy of Gitanjali of Rabindranath Tagore. This was later sent by his mother to the poet. In a part of a poem entitled Anthem for Doomed Youth, he writes, "What passing bells for those who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayer nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. And each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds." About 6,000 people died each day for 1,500 days. Nearly 74 million people were mobilized. Of the 48 million who had served the Allied armies, nearly 18 million were casualties, not including the missing persons. The Central Powers had mobilized 25.5 million men, of which 12.4 million had been casualties. In all, about 9.4 million people died or were missing. 21.2 million were wounded, and 7 million men might have been permanently disabled. Many civilians also died of war-related causes. Most of these young men were in the prime of their lives. The flower of European youth withered during the war. The devastations indeed traumatized a whole generation in Europe. There was a new genre of poetry called war poetry, particularly in English. These lines of Rupert Brooke evoke the tragic sensibility of the time. He had put these words in the mouth of an English soldier. "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Here we notice the strange linking of tragedy with nationalism. Philip Larkin, a British poet, also wrote, "Never such innocence again." He was referring to the decades before the war. American writer Scott Fitzgerald hoped that, quote, "no European will ever do that in this generation," unquote. His expectation was belied as another war came in 2 decades' time. The cost of the war was also staggering. $338 billion had been spent during the war. The war finally came to an end in 1918 after continuing for 4 years. The war had started between the two systems of alliances. The Triple Entente representing France, England, and Russia. The Triple Alliance comprising Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Bulgaria, and Turkey. After the war had started, Italy switched alliance in 1915 and joined the Entente powers. Russia left the alliance midway through the war after the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Bolsheviks withdrew from what they called an imperialist war. The war finally came to an end on 11th November 1918 when Germany signed an armistice. I should have mentioned this earlier, that America joined the war in 1917 in the early part, while Russia left the war in the same year. The armistice was to form the basis of peacemaking. The victorious powers were now what came to be known as the Big Four: England, France, Italy, and USA. And Germany, Turkey, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary remained the defeated powers. There is no doubt that America's joining the war had come as a great relief to the war-weary European powers, particularly insofar as pumping in of money by way of debt was concerned. President Wilson of the USA, he also announced his celebrated 14 points, which he said would form the basis of the peace settlement that would be negotiated. And when Germans laid down war and accepted the armistice, it was their expectation that the 14 points of President Wilson will indeed provide the basis on which the peace would be negotiated. Later, they were to complain that the peace as it was effected deviated in many essentials from the 14 points or the principles suggested by President Wilson. Wilson enunciated some general principles and also some specificities which would be affected in course of the settlement. First of all, he talked about open covenants of peace openly arrived at. This was a critique of the old secret diplomacy, which many thought had laid the root of the fault line in the international structure of politics. Negotiations would be open in full public view, and there should be no cloak and dagger attitude about this. Secondly, he also talked of free and impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. Thirdly, free navigation of the seas during peace and war, and free trade. Wilson suggested a general disarmament to the lowest point consistent with national safety. The point was that disarmament would by itself increase the sense of security among the nations and thus reduce substantially international tension, brightening chances of continuing or enduring peace. It also suggested lines along which the territorial claims, which obviously lay at the back of the war, would be generally settled. He talked of, in the specific cases, talked of the revival of a free and independent Poland with access to the C. There should be right of self-determination for the national minorities. The idea was that nationalism which sought independence within the multi-ethnic empires must now be given their due share and independence, now particularly in view of the fact that the multinational empires had virtually disintegrated. He also talked of a League of Nations which would provide an institutional basis for international cooperation and management of peace. Germany, it was expected, would pay a compensation for the damage done to the Allied civilian population and their property because they were largely believed to have caused the war. The Big Four who were represented in the Versailles had been President Wilson, Lloyd George of England, Tiger Clemenceau from France, and Orlando from Italy. The victors, however, did not have an uniform agenda. The victors had also participated in the war with their own kind of objectives. If Germany was trying to break out of encirclement through a short war, which turned out to be a long and protracted war, the victorious powers also had their agenda. Now, when they came to the table of the peace conference, the diversities of opinion tended to hamper smooth negotiation. France, for example, wanted not only Germany to be disarmed totally. France remembered the trauma of having been overcome by Prussian and then German army in 1869-70 and then again after 1914. So France wanted Germany disarmed almost permanently, and she wanted physical occupation of the left bank of the Rhine as a real physical guarantee of their own security. France was obsessed about this security. Well, Britain did not disagree with keeping Germany disarmed and militarily weak. She was not in favor of keeping Germany economically weak. A revival of the economy of Germany was something that Britain favored because of her rather strong business and commercial links with Germany. But France wanted to keep Germany weak on all counts, and this had not been very easy. Italy, on the other hand, had switched alliance and joined the Triple Entente powers to regain territories which she thought to be essentially Italian. But this was obviously to create certain problems, and Italy did remain unsatisfied. However, there had been hard bargaining, but what really characterized the Versailles Treaty was the treatment meted out to the Germans. The German delegates were brought into the conference hall and taken out of it like war criminals, war prisoners, and they were ultimately, it was not really a negotiated peace, but something that was forced on the Germans. The Germans were forced to sign on the dotted line or face a resumption of war. This was not really the kind of open negotiation that Wilson had led the Germans to expect. In the event, however, the peace treaties comprised several treaties. The Treaty of Versailles with Germany was signed on 28th of June 1919. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria came on 10th September 1919. The Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria came in November 1919, and that of Trianon with Hungary came only in 1920, in June 1920, because of political upheaval inside Hungary. And finally, there's the treaties of Sèvres, and finally that of Lausanne with Turkey, by which time the Republic of Turkey had been established and Kemal Pasha had risen to power. Let us briefly examine the terms of this treaty. The Treaty of Versailles was signed with Germany. First, there were the territorial provisions. Germany had to cede Alsace-Lorraine to France, Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium. These were the ones in the east. Northern Schleswig was eventually handed over to Denmark after a plebiscite. They kept southern Schleswig. Rhineland was to be permanently demilitarized. There would be a League of Nations commission looking after the Saar Basin. Allied army would continue to occupy Germany, but there would be gradual withdrawal over the years and complete withdrawal after a certain time. In the east, Germany had to give up Posen and West Prussia to be transferred to Poland. Now, Poland was also given what was known as the Polish Corridor in order to give her access to the sea. Danzig at the mouth of the sea was made into a international port, a free port. Now, what happened was that this Polish corridor actually divided two parts of German territories, and the Germans did not like this at all. Poland also acquired Upper Silesia. This was a significant industrial area for Germany. Lithuania received Memel from Germany. Germany and Austria were prohibited to execute the Anschluss of the Union except with the express permission of the League of Nations. Germany was also obliged to hand over all her colonies to the Allies. In the military terms, Germany was virtually disarmed. She was to have only 100,000 armed forces. There would be no conscription. Army would mainly look after law and order problems and not much else. She would not have any air force, and she was to have only a limited number of ships in certain categories. This put paid to Germany's desire of being as great a naval power as England in the decades before the war. In the economic provisions, Germany lost control over much of her economic resources in terms of mineral resources and industrial areas. She lost her colonies and much of her overseas investments. German shipping, including merchant shipping, had also been crippled. Germany was compelled to accept her guilt by this Article 231, the guilt clause, and she was expected to pay compensation. The amount of compensation was not delineated in the treaty itself. There would be a compensation, there would be a commission, and the commission will finally determine the amount that Germany will pay. But what resulted really is that Germany lost nearly 25,000 square miles of territory and 70 million people who were now obliged to live under foreign rule. And therefore, this treaty was not exactly popular in Germany, to put it mildly. League of Nations was also included, the covenant of the League of Nations included in this treaty, though Germany was not to be a member immediately. The Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria actually witnessed the disintegration of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. New states were created out of this. Austria and Hungary remained two separate countries. Czechoslovakia was created out of it, a new state. Tyrol, Trentino and Istria, these are largely German territories which had now been given to Italy. Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Dalmatian coasts went to another new state, Yugoslavia, whose main component was the former state of Serbia. It was expected that this small compact state of Austria would continue as an independent entity. The Treaty of Trianon was signed with Hungary, which came at the end of the turmoil inside Hungary. Hungary also lost a whole lot of territory to Czechoslovakia. Slovakia and Ruthenia went to Czechoslovakia. Croatia and Slavonia went to Yugoslavia, and Transylvania went to Romania. So Hungary also lost quite a bit of territory, and some 3 million Magyars, as residents of Hungary, were obliged to live under alien rule. The Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria obliged her to cede western Thrace to Greece, and this was her only substantial territorial loss. But her position in the Balkan Peninsula and her desire to dominate the peninsula had certainly been reduced. All the defeated powers were also to pay compensation. And finally, a peace with Turkey came through, as I had noted earlier, the treaties of Sèvres and Lausanne finally. Now, this is in crux the main terms of the treaty, and one can see that the defeated powers had ceded territories where many of their nationals were obliged to live along with these ceded territories under alien rule, and Germany was totally disarmed. She had to pay a huge compensation. Her economy was in shambles. Germany was to experience galloping inflation. Now, all this were not taken heed of by the peacemakers at Versailles. Now, how do we assess the treaty? The Versailles Treaty has often been described as a dictated peace. Now, any peace treaty, in a way, is a dictated peace. For as H. Carr put it long time back, a defeated power seldom willingly accepts the consequences of its defeat. But there is no doubt that the element of dictation was more apparent in Versailles Treaty than in any other peace treaty of modern times. Now, this was certainly true, and particularly the fact that the German delegates were taken in and out of the conference hall like prisoners of war did not help matters. And there is no doubt that the treaty did inflict a deep wound on the German psyche, which a section of the right wing, including the Army High Command and the war veterans, utilized to propagate the legend of the stab in the back. As a result, revisionism became a strong point in German foreign policy, and indeed was to be the cornerstone of German foreign policy in the 20s. Revisionism related to the need to revise the Treaty of Versailles to give Germany what she claimed would be a fair deal. And this is something that was very significant. Such sentiments were not uniquely German. These sentiments were shared by many in the victorious countries as well, in the Allied countries as well. For example, Marshal Foch of France commented when he read the treaty, I'm quoting him, quote, "This isn't a peace, it's a 20-year truce," unquote. He was indeed to prove to be prophetic. But a far stronger critic of the settlement came from John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist. Keynes represented the British Treasury in the peace conference, and at the end of 1919 he wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace of Versailles. He called the Peace of Versailles as having a devastating effect on the economy of Europe. He argued that in the 50 years or so before the war, Europe had experienced what he called the happy age. Its economy was growing, its people was given an ever-increasing standard of living. Europe was able to feed an ever-increasing number. And not only that, European capital invested in other parts of the globe, according to him, led to economic development in those regions as well. He said after the war, this happy age had ended. One part of Europe was dead and other part was dying. And he said that the economic provisions imposed on Germany particularly had been very, very brutal. That Germany overseas investments were taken, her colonies were taken, her merchant shipping was destroyed, and therefore this was to put the nail on the coffin of European economy. And this is something that Keynes's views, that is, found concordance in the heart of many who were disillusioned and disenchanted in the post-war years. However, Etienne Mantoux later wrote another book called The Carthaginian Peace or the Economic Consequences of Mr. Keynes, in which he said that the economic defects of the treaty were for the better part exaggerated or illusory. He, however, considered that the political defects were very glaring. There is no doubt that the task of peacemaking was not easy. The governments were strung by or hamstrung by many agreements reached earlier. You know, when the alliances were made, there were talk of division of territories, and if these had to be implemented, then it was impossible to create national self-determination in its totality. It was inevitable that national minorities would be living everywhere. There were Germans in the new states, there were Czech minorities or Slovak minorities, there were Magyar minorities living elsewhere, there were Poles, some Poles living in Germany, and these minorities did create a problem. But in attenuation of the Versailles peacemakers, it can be said that there was provision for minority treaties. There was this argument that Germany was disarmed, but this was to be followed by a general disarmament as per President Wilson's terms. The overall disarmament, peacemaking, the problem of minorities were to be supervised by the new international organization that was visualized, the Treaty of Versailles, namely the League of Nations. Now, obviously the critique of the Treaty of Versailles is valid in many points, probably in most points. But there is no doubt that Germany could have and should have been treated with little more grace, and that might have avoided the psychological damage that was caused in Germany. Now, there is no that there were defects, but there had also been attempts to manage the defects. For example, I mentioned the minority treaties. The minorities were to be dealt with justice in the areas where they were living. This was always obviously not effective. But one point might be mentioned, that it would not be right to suggest that all the infelicities of the treaty resulted in the Second World War. There were other more serious reasons for that.